The sound of a Kmart blue light special is a particular kind of American nostalgia, a siren that once sent shoppers running through aisles in pursuit of temporary discounts on items they didn't know they needed until a voice on the intercom told them they did. It's 1988, and somewhere in suburban America a blue light is flashing over the housewares section, casting its rotating glow on carts full of laundry detergent and plastic storage bins and whatever else caught shoppers' attention during their weekly pilgrimage to the big box store that promised everything at discount prices. The light spins, the announcement plays, and customers converge with the practiced efficiency of people who have internalized the ritual of hunting for deals. This is the promise of Kmart, the promise that transformed American retail, the promise that you could buy everything you needed in one place at prices lower than traditional retailers charged, the promise of discount abundance made, real through scale and efficiency, and a willingness to locate in places that other retailers ignored. At its peak, measured not by a single moment but by the accumulated weight of decades as America's discount store of choice, Kmart wasn't just a retailer. It was infrastructure, as fundamental to American consumer life as grocery stores or gas stations, a presence so ubiquitous that over 2,000 locations dotted the landscape from coast to coast, anchoring shopping centers and strip malls and standalone sites along every commercial corridor in the country. Annual revenues approached $40 billion at the height, a staggering number that represented the aggregated purchases of millions of American families who trusted Kmart to provide the basics of modern life at prices they could afford. The company pioneered the discount department store concept, opened its first store in 1962, the same year that Walmart and Target launched their first locations, and for decades Kmart was the leader, the innovator, the model that others copied. The blue light became cultural shorthand for American consumerism, referenced in movies and television shows, embedded in the collective consciousness as a symbol of bargain hunting and middle-class thrift. But leadership in retail is fragile, dependent on constant adaptation and operational excellence and strategic decisions that compound over years into competitive advantage or terminal decline. Kmart had every advantage in the 1970s and 80s, was larger than Walmart, more established than Target, positioned perfectly to dominate the discount retail category for generations. Instead, it collapsed, filed for bankruptcy in 2002 in what was then the largest retail bankruptcy in American history. Stumbled through a disastrous merger with Sears that destroyed both companies. Filed for bankruptcy again in 2018 and was reduced to a handful of stores operating on life support, zombie locations that exist more as curiosities than functioning retail operations. This is the story of one of the greatest squanderings of competitive advantage in American business history, a case study in how not to run a retail company, a tragedy of mismanagement so comprehensive that business schools will study it for generations. The collapse of Kmart is often explained through simple narratives. Walmart beat them on price. Target beat them on style. They couldn't compete, and so they failed. But this explanation is both true and misleading, accurate about the outcome but incomplete about the causes. Kmart didn't lose to Walmart and Target because those competitors were inherently superior, or because market forces made Kmart's failure inevitable. Kmart lost because of specific decisions made by specific executives who prioritized the wrong things, who understood retail as financial engineering rather than operational excellence, who believed that deals and acquisitions and financial maneuvers could substitute for the hard work of running stores well. It's a story about how companies can destroy themselves from within, how advantages can be squandered through neglect and arrogance and the elevation of people who had no business running a retail empire. The origin story begins not with Kmart but with S.S. Kresge Company, founded in 1899 as a variety store chain, the kind of small-format downtown retailers that sold everything from sewing supplies to household goods to cheap toys, serving working-class customers who couldn't afford department store prices. For decades, Kresge stores were modest operations, profitable but not particularly ambitious, part of the retail landscape but not transforming it. The transformation came in 1962 when Kresge opened its first K-mart, a large-format discount store in Garden City, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. Take the variety, store model, and scale it up dramatically. Create a massive store that could stock thousands of items across every category. Use volume purchasing power to negotiate lower prices from suppliers. Pass some of those savings to customers while maintaining acceptable margins. Locate in suburbs where land was cheap and parking was abundant. And target middle-class families who wanted convenience and value more than prestige or service. The first Kmart was an immediate success, validating the concept and triggering rapid expansion. By 1967, there were 250 Kmart stores. By 1976, there were over 1,000. The growth was staggering, fueled by the perfect alignment of demographic trends, economic conditions, and retail innovation. Post-war suburban expansion created exactly the kind of markets Kmart served. Families with kids and cars and mortgages looking for affordable goods. Rising standards of living meant more disposable income, but also more cost consciousness, a desire to get good value rather than spending unnecessarily. The decline of downtown shopping districts and the rise of shopping centers and strip malls created real estate opportunities where large-format stores could thrive. Kmart was in the right place at the right time with the right concept, and they executed brilliantly through the 1970s, becoming the second-largest retailer in America behind only Sears, well ahead of the upstart Walmart that was still primarily a rural southern retailer. But success creates vulnerabilities, particularly when success comes quickly and seems easy, when growth happens so fast that systems and culture can't keep pace, when the people running the company start believing their own mythology about being retail geniuses rather than understanding they were executing a good concept in favorable conditions. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, Kmart's management began making a series of decisions that individually seemed reasonable but collectively moved the company away from its operational foundations and toward a more financialized model of retail. They diversified, acquiring other retail chains and brands that had nothing to do with discount stores, attempting to build a retail conglomerate rather than focusing on what made Kmart successful. They bought Walden Books, Borders, Builders Square, OfficeMax, Sports Authority, creating a sprawling portfolio of different retail concepts that required different expertise and different management approaches and different operational systems. The diversification strategy consumed management attention and capital that should have been invested in the core Kmart business, in supply chain and technology and store operations and all the unglamorous but essential infrastructure that makes discount retail work at scale. While Kmart's executives were playing empire builder, Walmart was investing in logistics and inventory, management and supply chain efficiency, building the operational capabilities that would make them unbeatable. Walmart installed sophisticated computer systems to track inventory and sales in real time, to automate reordering, to optimize distribution center operations and trucking routes. They built their own distribution centers strategically located to serve clusters of stores efficiently. They developed vendor relationships and supply chain practices that reduced costs and improved inventory turnover. They did the boring, difficult, unglamorous work of making retail operations more efficient, of executing better than competitors, of turning operational excellence into sustainable competitive advantage. Kmart, by contrast, neglected these investments, continued operating with outdated systems and manual processes and distribution networks that were inefficient compared to what Walmart was building. The stores themselves, which had seemed modern and adequate in the 1970s, began to deteriorate as maintenance was deferred and investment was directed elsewhere. The fixtures dated. The layouts became cluttered and confusing. The cleanliness declined as staffing was cut to maintain margins. The employee training and development that had once been part of Kmart's culture eroded as the company treated workers as costs to minimize rather than assets to develop. By the late 1980s, you could walk into a Kmart and a Walmart in the same market and see immediately which company was investing in operations and which was coasting on past success. The Walmart would be clean and well lit and organized with products in stock and employees who knew where things were. The Kmart would feel tired and cluttered with empty shelves and products in the wrong places and employees who were as frustrated as customers. The customers noticed. Market share began shifting slowly at first but then accelerating as shoppers discovered that Walmart offered lower prices and better availability and a more pleasant shopping experience. Kmart's response to this competitive pressure revealed the fundamental disconnect between management and operational reality. Instead of investing in stores and systems and getting back to retail basics, they doubled down on promotional activity and marketing gimmicks, thinking they could advertise and promote their way to continued dominance. The Blue Light Special, which had started as a clever way to create excitement and move inventory, became a crutch, a substitute for actually being competitively priced on everyday items. Customers learned to wait for Blue Light Specials rather than buying at regular prices, which meant that Kmart was constantly discounting, constantly training customers that the regular prices were too high, constantly eroding their own margins to maintain traffic. The financial performance began deteriorating in the early 1990s, not catastrophically, but enough to worry investors and analysts who could see that Walmart was outperforming Kmart on every meaningful metric. Revenue growth slowed, same-store sales growth turned negative. Profit margins compressed as promotional activity increased and operational inefficiency ate into whatever pricing power remained. The stock price stagnated while Walmart soared, creating a valuation gap that reflected investor belief that Walmart was the future and Kmart was the past. The board of directors cycled through CEOs, each arriving with their own vision for turning around the company, each discovering that fixing decades of neglect and operational deterioration is far harder than creating problems through bad decisions. In 1995, Kmart hired Floyd Hall as CEO, bringing in an outsider with retail experience who was supposed to bring fresh thinking and drive transformation. Hall's strategy was to invest heavily in remodeling stores to a new prototype called Big Kmart, larger formats with improved layouts and better lighting and wider aisles and an emphasis on consumables and household goods that generated frequent purchases. The Big Kmart concept was sound in theory, addressing real problems with the existing store base, attempting to compete more directly with Walmart on the dimensions that mattered to customers. But the execution was problematic and the timing was terrible. The remodeling program was expensive, requiring billions in capital investment at a time when the company was struggling financially, and when every dollar spent on remodeling was a dollar not available for systems and supply chain and the operational infrastructure that Walmart had already built. The remodeled stores looked better, certainly more modern and appealing than the dated Kmarts they replaced. But looking better didn't solve the fundamental problems. The inventory systems were still inferior to Walmart's, which meant products were still frequently out of stock or in the wrong places. The supply chain was still less efficient, which meant costs were still higher and margins were still under pressure. The employee training and retention were still inadequate, which meant service was still poor and execution was still inconsistent. You can't fix operational problems with cosmetic improvements, can't substitute capital investment in physical stores for operational excellence, can't compete with Walmart by looking more like Walmart while still operating like Kmart. The big Kmart program consumed billions and generated minimal return, leaving the company more indebted and no more competitive than before. Hall also pursued a disastrous acquisition strategy, buying other struggling retailers and creating a portfolio of different formats that management had no expertise running and no ability to integrate effectively. In 1998, they spent nearly $6 billion to acquire the Canadian retailer Zellers, loading the company with debt to expand into a market they didn't understand. The acquisition failed to generate expected returns, became a distraction and a drag on financial performance, ultimately had to be sold at a loss years later. The pattern repeated with other acquisitions, each one consuming capital and management attention, each one failing to create value, each one making the core problems worse by diverting resources and focus away from fixing what was broken. By 2000, Kmart was in serious financial distress, burning cash, unable to service its debt from operations, facing a competitive environment where Walmart was dominant and Target was successfully executing a hipper, more design-conscious version of discount retail that attracted younger shoppers. Kmart was stuck in the middle, unable to compete with Walmart on price and efficiency, unable to compete with Target on style and brand perception, unable to articulate a clear value proposition that would give customers a reason to choose Kmart over alternatives that were objectively better. The company brought in Charles Conaway as CEO in 2000, a former pharmacy executive with no retail operations experience, tasked with executing yet another turnaround plan that looked good in PowerPoint presentations but had no grounding in retail reality. Conaway's tenure was a masterclass in how not to run a retail company, combining operational incompetence with financial manipulation and personal enrichment in ways that accelerated Kmart's decline while making him wealthy. He continued the ill-advised acquisition strategy, buying BlueLight.com in an attempt to compete in e-commerce despite having no expertise or infrastructure. He invested heavily in marketing and promotional activity, spending money the company didn't have on Super Bowl ads and celebrity endorsements, trying to rebrand Kmart as cool and relevant when the fundamental problems were that stores were dirty and inventory was unreliable and prices weren't competitive. He implemented aggressive sales targets and revenue recognition practices that papered over deteriorating fundamentals, creating the illusion of improvement while the business continued rotting from within. Behind the scenes, Kmart's supply chain and inventory management had reached crisis levels. Stores routinely ran out of basic items while simultaneously being stuffed with excess inventory of things that weren't selling. The distribution centers operated with outdated technology and inefficient processes, creating bottlenecks that meant merchandise sat in warehouses or trucks instead of being on store shelves where it could be sold. Vendors were extending payment terms or demanding cash in advance because they doubted Kmart's ability to pay its bills. Employees were demoralized, watching the company fail while management made increasingly desperate decisions and collected enormous compensation packages. Customers were abandoning Kmart in accelerating numbers, finding better options at Walmart or Target, or increasingly at online retailers like Amazon that offered superior selection and convenience. The financial situation became unsustainable in late 2001. The company was burning through hundreds of millions in cash each quarter, unable to generate enough from operations to fund inventory purchases and operating expenses and debt service. Vendors were cutting off credit, refusing to ship merchandise without payment in advance, creating inventory shortages that made sales decline faster. The banks providing credit facilities were demanding repayment and refusing to extend additional credit. The company was in a liquidity death spiral where declining sales reduced cash generation, which reduced inventory, which reduced sales further in an accelerating cycle that had no solution within the existing structure. On January 22, 2002, Kmart filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, listing $37 billion in assets against $17 billion in liabilities, numbers that revealed both the scale of the company and the magnitude of its failure. The bankruptcy was traumatic, the largest retail bankruptcy in American history at the time, a humiliating acknowledgement that a company that had once dominated American discount retail had failed so completely that it couldn't continue operating without court protection from its creditors. 37,000 workers lost their jobs in the immediate aftermath as Kmart closed over 280 stores deemed unviable. Vendors who were owed billions for merchandise they had shipped in good faith were told they would receive pennies on the dollar if they received anything at all. Landlords who depended on Kmart as anchor tenants watched as leases were rejected and stores went dark, taking mall traffic and rent income with them. Communities that had relied on Kmart for affordable shopping and local employment found themselves with empty, big-box buildings and no obvious replacement. The bankruptcy process, overseen by a judge in Illinois and managed by restructuring professionals who specialized in extracting maximum value from failed companies, was brutal in its efficiency. Creditors formed committees and hired lawyers and fought over who would get paid in what order. The company continued operating, selling merchandise at deep discounts to generate cash, closing stores and laying off workers to reduce costs, desperately trying to prove it could be viable if just enough obligations were eliminated and enough stores were closed. The bankruptcy lasted 22 months, during which Kmart shed debt and stores and workers and whatever remained of its reputation. Emerging in May 2004, technically solvent but fundamentally broken, smaller and weaker, and with no clear path to competing effectively against Walmart and Target, who had continued growing stronger while Kmart was in bankruptcy. What happened next was perhaps even more destructive than the bankruptcy itself. In 2005, a hedge fund manager named Eddie Lampert orchestrated a merger between Kmart and Sears, creating Sears Holdings Corporation in a deal that was presented as a strategic combination of two iconic American retailers but was actually the beginning of the end for both companies. Lampert had no retail experience, no operational expertise, no understanding of what makes retail companies successful. What he had was a theory that retail real estate was undervalued, that Sears and Kmart together owned or controlled billions in property that could be monetized through various financial engineering schemes, that he could extract value from these assets while running the retail operations as cash-generating machines that required minimal investment. It was the mentality of a financial engineer applied to operating businesses, the belief that spreadsheets and financial models could substitute for the hard work of running stores well. The Sears-Kmart merger destroyed both companies, turned two struggling but potentially salvageable retailers into a slow-motion liquidation that took over a decade and left behind thousands of empty stores and hundreds of thousands of lost jobs. Lampert ran the combined company from his hedge fund offices in Connecticut, rarely visiting stores, making decisions based on financial metrics rather than operational reality, implementing policies that made sense on spreadsheets but were disastrous for actually serving customers. He cut costs relentlessly, reducing store staffing to skeleton crews that couldn't provide adequate service, deferring maintenance until stores became shabby and unappealing, reducing inventory investment, which meant shelves were empty and customers couldn't find what they needed. He pitted different divisions against each other in a bizarre experiment in internal competition, believing that forcing parts of the company to compete for resources would drive efficiency, when in reality it just created dysfunction and destroyed whatever remained of cohesive strategy. He extracted value from real estate, selling properties and leasing them back, selling valuable brands like Craftsman and Kenmore and Die Hard. Anything that could generate cash that could be paid out to shareholders, primarily to himself since he controlled the majority of shares through his hedge fund. The retail operations deteriorated year after year with declining sales and store closures and constant headlines about how Sears Holdings was dying. Workers watched helplessly as the company they depended on was systematically dismantled, as stores closed and colleagues were laid off and the remaining locations became sadder and emptier. Customers abandoned Sears and Kmart in massive numbers, finding better options at literally any competitor. From Walmart and Target to Home Depot and Lowe's to Amazon and countless others who actually invested in their businesses rather than extracting from them. The Kmart stores within Sears Holdings became particularly sad examples of retail decline. Zombie locations that continued operating despite having no competitive advantages and no reason for customers to shop there. The stores were dirty and poorly maintained, with flickering fluorescent lights and scuffed floors and fixtures that hadn't been updated since the 1990s. The inventory was sparse and poorly merchandised, with vast sections of empty shelves and products that seemed randomly placed rather than thoughtfully organized. The employees who remained were demoralized and poorly trained, doing their best with inadequate resources and no support from management that was physically and psychologically distant from store operations. Shopping at Kmart in the 2010s was a depressing experience. A reminder of what the company had once been and how far it had fallen, a retail graveyard that somehow still had hours of operation and customers desperate enough or nostalgic enough to shop there. The vendors and suppliers who had relationships with Kmart going back decades faced impossible choices as the company declined. They could continue shipping merchandise on extended payment terms, risking non-payment if the company failed. Or they could demand cash in advance or refuse to ship at all, which would accelerate the decline but protect them from losses. Many chose the latter, particularly smaller suppliers who couldn't afford the risk, creating inventory gaps that made the stores even less competitive. The larger suppliers, the Procter & Gamble's and Hasbro's and other major brands, had more complicated relationships because Kmart still represented billions in annual sales despite the decline. But even they began reducing their exposure, shipping less inventory and demanding better payment terms, and treating Kmart as a credit risk rather than a strategic partner. The landlords who owned the properties where Kmart stores operated watched with growing concern as the company deteriorated, understanding that losing a Kmart anchor would damage their properties but unable to prevent it. Kmart used bankruptcy and the threat of bankruptcy as leverage to negotiate reduced rents and better lease terms, extracting concessions from landlords who preferred reduced rent to empty space. Some landlords tried to find replacement tenants before Kmart closed, lining up other retailers to take the space. But replacing a 100,000-square-foot box is difficult when retail is in general decline and few retailers are expanding. Many properties remained empty for years after Kmart closed, becoming blight on commercial corridors, visual evidence of retail transformation and economic decline. In 2018, after years of managed decline and store closures and financial deterioration, Sears Holdings filed for bankruptcy again, the second Kmart bankruptcy and the first Sears bankruptcy in the combined company's history. The filing listed billions in debts against assets that were increasingly questionable in value, primarily real estate and inventory that had to be liquidated at deep discounts. Eddie Lampert, through another one of his entities, bought what remained out of bankruptcy, keeping a couple hundred Sears and Kmart stores operating in a further reduced form. But this wasn't a rescue or a turnaround, just a continuation of the same extraction strategy. Keeping stores open as long as they generated cash that could be extracted while managing the decline to minimize legal and financial obligations. The workers who lost their jobs in the 2018 bankruptcy and subsequent closures faced labor markets that had been transformed by the same forces that destroyed Kmart. The retail jobs that might have been available a generation earlier were gone, replaced by lower-paying service work or gig economy positions that offered no stability or benefits. Many of the displaced workers were older, had spent careers at Kmart or Sears, had skills and experience that were valuable in traditional retail but increasingly obsolete in an e-commerce-dominated market. They faced age discrimination in trying to find new employment, faced the reality that their accumulated experience counted for little when the entire industry was dying. Some found work at Walmart or Target or other surviving retailers, usually at lower wages and with less job security. Others left the workforce entirely, retiring earlier than planned on inadequate savings, dependent on Social Security and whatever pensions they might have accrued. The communities that lost Kmart stores experienced the loss differently depending on their size and economic diversity. In larger cities with multiple retail options, the Kmart closure was inconvenient, but not catastrophic, one option disappearing among many. In smaller communities, particularly rural areas where Kmart might have been the only discount retailer within 30 miles, the closure was devastating, forcing residents to drive significant distances to access basic goods, disadvantaging people without cars or with limited mobility, creating retail deserts that disproportionately affected lower-income families who had depended on Kmart's combination of selection and price. The empty Kmart buildings became symbols of economic decline, particularly when they sat vacant for years, too large and too outdated to attract new tenants, too expensive to demolish and redevelop, just sitting empty and deteriorating and reminding everyone of what had been lost. The contrast between Kmart's fate and Walmart's success is instructive because these companies started in the same year with the same basic concept and faced the same market conditions. Yet one became the largest company in the world while the other collapsed into irrelevance. The difference wasn't market forces or luck or inevitable trends. The difference was decisions. Specific choices made by specific people about what to prioritize and how to compete and where to invest. Walmart chose operational excellence, invested relentlessly in supply chain and technology and logistics, treated retail as an execution business where success came from doing the basics better than anyone else. Kmart chose financial engineering and diversification and marketing gimmicks, treated retail as a financial game where success came from deals and acquisitions and promotional activity rather than operational fundamentals. Walmart's founder, Sam Walton, was obsessed with stores, visited them constantly, understood retail at a granular level, built a culture around operational excellence and cost control and customer service. Kmart's executives in the critical 1980s and 90s were corporate managers who viewed retail from a distance, made decisions in boardrooms based on financial analysis rather than store visits and customer interaction and understanding what made discount retail work. This cultural difference compounded over decades into a gulf that became unbridgeable, creating a situation where Walmart was so far ahead operationally that Kmart could never catch up no matter how much they invested or how dramatically they restructured. The lessons from Kmart's collapse are clear but apparently difficult for companies to internalize because similar patterns keep repeating in American retail and other industries. Operational excellence matters more than financial engineering. Investing in the basics of the business and systems and supply chain and store operations and employee training generates more value than acquisitions and diversification and promotional activity. Retail is a low-margin execution business where small advantages in efficiency and effectiveness compound over time into sustainable competitive positions. Companies that lose focus on operations, that prioritize financial metrics over customer experience, that think they can manage their way to success without understanding the business at a granular level, eventually fail regardless of their history or their brand or their market position. The tragedy of Kmart is not that they lost to Walmart because someone had to be number one and someone had to be number two in discount retail. The tragedy is that they had every advantage, had a decade head start on Walmart, had more stores and more revenue and better locations and stronger brand recognition in the 1970s. They squandered all of it through bad decisions and misplaced priorities, and the elevation of executives who had no business running a retail company. They could have competed effectively with Walmart if they had invested in operations and maintained focus on discount retail fundamentals and executed well. Instead, they diversified and financialized and neglected the basics, creating the conditions for their own failure while Walmart did the hard, boring work of building superior operations. The human cost of Kmart's collapse extends far beyond the workers who lost their jobs or the communities that lost stores. It includes the suppliers who went bankrupt when Kmart couldn't pay them, the landlords who lost anchor tenants and saw their properties deteriorate, the pension funds and retirement accounts that held Kmart stock and lost billions when the company failed, the families and communities that depended on Kmart for affordable shopping and local employment. These costs never appear in bankruptcy filings or financial statements, but they're real and they're substantial, and they represent the hidden price of corporate failure in American capitalism. The few Kmart stores that still operate, maybe a dozen or so scattered across the country as of 2025, exist primarily as curiosities, destinations for retail enthusiasts and nostalgic shoppers who remember what Kmart used to be. Zombie locations that generate minimal sales and operate on the barest of resources. They're not competitive retailers in any meaningful sense, not stores that most people would choose to shop at given alternatives, not businesses that are investing in future success or building toward anything. They're just the last remnants of something that once mattered, kept operating through some combination of lease obligations and Eddie Lampert's continued extraction strategy, and the inertia that keeps failed enterprises stumbling forward long after they should have been buried. Walking through one of these remaining Kmarts is a study in retail depression, an experience that makes clear why the company failed and why it deserves to fail. The store is dim because many light fixtures are burned out and haven't been replaced. The shelves are half empty because inventory investment has been minimized and vendors are reluctant to ship. The merchandise that is there seems random and poorly chosen, clearance items and off-brands and products that suggest nobody is actually managing what gets ordered and displayed. The employees are few and seem as depressed as the store itself, doing the minimum required because there's no point in going beyond that for a company that's clearly dying. The customers are sparse and desperate, people who have no better options or who are shopping at Kmart out of some misplaced loyalty or nostalgia for what the store used to represent. This is what remains of a company that once had over 2,000 stores and employed hundreds of thousands of workers and served tens of millions of customers and pioneered the discount retail format that transformed American consumer culture. The blue light special is gone. The competitive prices are gone. The selection is gone. The reasons to shop at Kmart are gone. What remains is just real estate and a brand name that has negative value, that carries associations of failure and decline and everything wrong with American retail. The company that competed with Walmart and lost has been reduced to a joke, a punchline, a cautionary tale so obvious that business students wonder how executives could have been so incompetent. The real question about Kmart is not why it failed, because the why is clear and well documented and obvious to anyone who studies retail. The real question is whether anything could be learned from the failure that might prevent similar collapses in the future, whether there are systemic changes that could protect companies from this kind of self-destruction, whether we can structure capitalism in ways that reward operational excellence and punish financial extraction and protect stakeholders from the consequences of executive incompetence. The answer is probably no, because the incentives are wrong and the people in charge are insulated from consequences and the market rewards short-term gains, even when they come at the expense of long-term sustainability. Eddie Lampert, who presided over the destruction of Sears and Kmart, made hundreds of millions through his various schemes and extraction strategies, collecting fees and dividends and proceeds from asset sales, while the companies he controlled collapsed. The executives who ran Kmart into the ground in the 1990s and early 2000s collected their compensation and bonuses and stock options and moved on to destroy other companies or retire wealthy. The consultants and lawyers and investment bankers who facilitated the bad decisions and the bankruptcies and the merger that destroyed both companies all got paid. The people who bore the costs were workers and communities and suppliers and customers, people who had no say in the decisions that destroyed what they depended on but who absorbed all the consequences. In empty Kmart locations across America, you can still see the traces of what was. The industrial blue and red color scheme faded but recognizable. The layout that once seemed so modern and efficient, now just obsolete. The shopping carts still marked with Kmart logos rusting in parking lots. The signs advertising blue light specials that will never happen again. These spaces are monuments to failure, evidence of how companies can destroy themselves through neglect and arrogance and the prioritization of financial engineering over operational excellence. They're not dramatic ruins in the way that abandoned factories or grand department stores might be dramatic. They're just empty retail boxes, forgettable spaces that were never beautiful. Utilitarian architecture that served a function and no longer does. But they represent something important about American economic life, about how we structure companies and allocate resources and protect or fail to protect the people and communities that depend on those companies. The light that once guided shoppers to deals, that blue rotating beacon that meant savings and excitement and the thrill of finding bargains, has been dark for years. In most places, the fixtures removed or broken or simply unplugged because nobody cares enough to maintain even the symbols of what Kmart once was. In the handful of stores that remain, if the blue light still exists, it probably doesn't work, probably sits in a corner covered in dust, a relic of a different era of retail when Kmart mattered and competed and served a real purpose in American commercial life. The silence in those stores, the absence of the announcements and the running feet and the excitement that once characterized blue light specials, is louder than any sound could be. A silence that speaks of failure and waste and opportunities squandered and the particular sadness of watching something that once worked destroy itself through a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable but collectively led nowhere except down. The story of how Kmart went from market leader to bankruptcy requires understanding the specific operational failures that compounded over years into catastrophic disadvantage. In the 1970s, when Kmart was larger than Walmart and growing faster, both companies faced the same fundamental challenge of managing inventory across hundreds of stores, of ensuring products were available when customers wanted them, of minimizing the capital tied up in excess inventory while avoiding stockouts that cost sales. Walmart approached this challenge with a fanaticism about technology and systems and data, investing heavily in computer systems that could track sales and inventory in real time, that could automate reordering based on actual consumption patterns, that could optimize the flow of goods from vendors through distribution centers to stores. Sam Walton personally championed these investments, understanding that superior information systems would create competitive advantages that compounded over time, that knowing what was selling and what wasn't, and being able to respond faster than competitors would translate directly into higher sales and better margins. Walmart built its own satellite communication network in the 1980s, an extraordinary investment for a retailer to enable real-time data transmission between stores and headquarters and distribution centers. They implemented point-of-sale systems that captured every transaction, creating data that could be analyzed to understand buying patterns and optimize inventory. They developed sophisticated algorithms for distribution center management and truck routing, squeezing inefficiency out of logistics in ways that reduced costs by fractions of pennies per item, fractions that added up to billions across the volume Walmart handled. Kmart, watching Walmart invest billions in these systems, made a different calculation. They believed that technology investments delivered diminishing returns, that they could maintain their market position through marketing and promotional activity and real estate strategy rather than operational excellence. They continued operating with older systems and manual processes, with inventory management that depended on human judgment rather than data and algorithms, with distribution networks that were less efficient because they hadn't been optimized through the same kind of systematic analysis that Walmart applied. In the short term, this decision looked financially sound. Kmart avoided the capital expenditures that Walmart was making, maintained higher short-term profits, satisfied shareholders who cared about quarterly earnings rather than long-term competitive position. But in retail, operational advantages compound. Walmart's superior systems meant they knew what was selling and could restock faster, which meant better in-stock positions, which meant higher sales, which meant more data to improve the systems further. Their distribution efficiency meant lower costs, which meant they could price lower or maintain better margins, which meant more competitive pressure on Kmart. Their inventory turnover was faster, which meant less capital tied up in inventory, which meant more cash available for expansion or further investment. The gap widened every year, every quarter, every day, as Walmart's operational machine got stronger while Kmart's relative weakness became more pronounced. By the 1990s, the operational gap was so large that Kmart couldn't close it through any realistic investment, would have needed to rebuild their entire infrastructure while simultaneously operating stores and competing with a Walmart that continued improving. The culture inside Kmart during the decline years reflected and reinforced these operational failures. Walmart had built a culture obsessed with costs and efficiency, where managers were expected to understand their operations in minute detail, where waste was treated as sin, where continuous improvement was not a buzzword but a daily practice. Kmart's culture became politicized and dysfunctional, with executives focused on protecting their positions and blaming others for problems, with operational issues viewed as someone else's responsibility, with a fatalism that accepted mediocrity as inevitable. Store managers who raised concerns about inventory problems or staffing shortages or competitive pressures were told to make do, to execute better with the resources they had, to stop complaining and start performing. The message from corporate was clear. Operational problems were implementation failures, not strategic issues, and therefore not worthy of the attention of senior executives who were busy with more important matters like acquisitions and financial engineering. This cultural dysfunction manifested in visible ways to anyone who shopped at Kmart regularly during the 1990s and early 2000s. The stores became dirtier as cleaning schedules were reduced and staff was cut. The organization became more chaotic as planograms went unfollowed and merchandise was placed randomly, wherever there was space. The stockouts became more frequent as the inventory systems failed to reorder items that had sold, leaving empty pegs and shelves where popular items should have been. The employee morale became visibly worse as workers realized they were expected to maintain standards that were impossible with the resources provided, as they watched the company deteriorate and knew their jobs were at risk but had no power to change anything. Customers noticed all of this and voted with their feet and their wallets, gradually shifting their purchasing to Walmart or Target or other retailers who provided better experiences. The defection was gradual rather than sudden, which made it harder for Kmart management to recognize the crisis until it was too late. Each individual customer who decided to shop elsewhere was imperceptible in the aggregate data. but thousands of customers making that same decision every week, millions making it over years, compounded into the massive market share loss that devastated Kmart's business model. By the time the crisis was undeniable, by the time sales were declining and profits had evaporated and bankruptcy was looming, the damage was so deep and so structural that no turnaround plan could reverse it. The vendor relationships that Kmart had built over decades deteriorated along with the operational performance. Suppliers who had valued their Kmart business and invested in supporting the relationship began pulling back as they saw Kmart lose market share and operational capability. The best vendors, the ones with the most desirable products and strongest brands, allocated their best inventory to Walmart and Target, where sales velocity was higher and payment was more reliable. Kmart got what was left, the excess inventory and second-tier products in terms that reflected their declining importance to vendor strategies. This created a vicious cycle where worse vendor relationships meant worse merchandise assortment, which meant worse customer experience, which meant more sales declines, which meant even worse vendor relationships. Procter & Gamble, Hasbro, Mattel, Levi's, all the major brands that had been Kmart suppliers for generations, began treating Kmart as a secondary channel, a place to dump excess inventory rather than a strategic partner deserving of premier products and marketing support. When vendors launched new products or exclusive items, they went to Walmart or Target first. When allocation was tight and not everyone could get the hot items, Kmart was deprioritized. When payment terms were negotiated, Kmart faced pressure to pay faster and provide better terms because vendors worried about their credit exposure. These disadvantages were individually small but collectively massive, creating a merchandise assortment that was objectively worse than what competitors offered, making Kmart less attractive to shoppers even if prices had been competitive, which increasingly they weren't. The real estate strategy that had once been a strength became a liability as malls and shopping centers declined, and Walmart's rural and suburban standalone strategy proved superior. Kmart had located primarily in traditional shopping centers and strip malls, becoming anchor tenants alongside other retailers benefiting from the foot traffic that malls generated. This worked well in the 1970s and 80s when malls were thriving and Americans enjoyed shopping as a social activity. But as malls declined and shopping became more purposeful and convenience-driven, Walmart's standalone supercenter format proved superior, offering easier parking and faster in-and-out shopping and longer hours of operation. Kmart was locked into long-term leases in declining locations, paying above-market rents for properties that generated declining traffic, unable to relocate to better sites without breaking leases and absorbing penalties. The store locations that had once been valuable assets became stranded investments. Money poured into building and maintaining stores in places where customers no longer wanted to shop. Kmart tried to renegotiate leases and exit bad locations, but landlords who had depended on Kmart as anchors fought to keep them, using lease terms and legal pressure to prevent closures. Some Kmart stores stayed open for years in dying malls, operating at losses, kept open only because closing would trigger lease penalties that exceeded the operational losses. These zombie stores destroyed capital and management attention, dragging down overall performance while providing no path to recovery. The apparel strategy, which had been a significant part of Kmart's business model with private label brands like Jaclyn Smith and Martha Stewart, became another area where operational failures turned potential strength into weakness. Kmart had invested in these celebrity partnerships and exclusive brands, creating differentiated merchandise that couldn't be found at Walmart. In theory, this should have been an advantage, a reason for customers to choose Kmart over pure price-focused competitors. In practice, the operational execution was so poor that the exclusive brands became liabilities. The merchandise was poorly displayed, mixed randomly with other items rather than merchandised as distinct collections. The sizing was inconsistent and the inventory was unreliable, with popular sizes frequently out of stock. The quality control was inadequate, with defects and fit issues that damaged the brand reputations and frustrated customers. Martha Stewart, who had licensed her name to Kmart for home goods and domestics, watched in frustration as the partnership that was supposed to elevate both brands instead damaged her reputation through association with Kmart's declining standards and execution. The merchandise was fine, sometimes quite good, but it was presented so poorly and supported so inadequately that customers couldn't appreciate it. Store employees weren't trained on the product lines, couldn't answer questions or help customers find what they needed. The displays were neglected and became cluttered and disorganized. The whole initiative became another example of Kmart having reasonable strategies undermined by operational incompetence, of good ideas destroyed by bad execution. The technology failures extended beyond inventory systems to every aspect of retail operations. The point-of-sale systems were outdated and unreliable, frequently crashing or running slowly, creating long checkout lines that frustrated customers. The credit card processing was slower than competitors, adding seconds to each transaction that multiplied into hours of customer wait time across all stores. The employee scheduling systems were manual or barely automated, creating staffing patterns that didn't match traffic patterns, leaving stores understaffed during busy times and overstaffed during slow periods. The price management systems were inadequate, meaning that prices in the computer often didn't match prices on shelf tags, creating customer service problems and erosion of trust when customers discovered discrepancies at checkout. These operational failures, individually small and seemingly fixable, compounded into a systematic disadvantage that made shopping at Kmart frustrating and unreliable and ultimately not worth the effort when Walmart or Target offered superior experiences. The customers who defected to competitors weren't making complex analytical decisions. They were responding to accumulated frustrations. To the third time they went to Kmart for something and it was out of stock. To the fifth time, the checkout line was unreasonably long because only 2 registers were open despite 10 being available. To the 10th time, the store was dirty and disorganized and the employees were unhelpful. These were small failures that added up to catastrophic loss of customer confidence and loyalty. The financial engineering that dominated Kmart's strategy in the late 1990s and early 2000s was a final insult to a company already weakened by operational neglect. Instead of acknowledging that the fundamental business model was broken and needed rebuilding from operational foundations, management doubled down on financial manipulation and acquisition-driven growth. They borrowed billions to buy other retailers, to fund promotional activity, to paper over the declining core business with the appearance of growth and activity. The debt that seemed manageable when sales were growing became crushing when sales declined, creating fixed obligations that consumed cash flow that might have been invested in fixing operations. The vendors who had extended credit to Kmart for decades began demanding cash on delivery or significantly shortened payment terms, recognizing that Kmart's financial condition was deteriorating and that being a creditor to a failing retailer was a good way to lose money. This created a cash crunch that made the inventory problems worse, as Kmart couldn't afford to fully stock stores even if the operational capability had existed. The best merchandise went to competitors who could pay faster, leaving Kmart with inferior selection that made sales decline faster. The cycle accelerated through 2001 until the bankruptcy was inevitable, the only question being exactly when it would be filed, rather than whether it would happen. The bankruptcy itself, when it finally came in January 2002, was a spectacle of value destruction on a scale that shocked even seasoned retail analysts. A company that had been worth tens of billions at its peak was now worth less than the liquidation value of its inventory and real estate. Over 280 stores were closed immediately, deemed so unprofitable that they weren't worth keeping open even at bankruptcy sale prices. Tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs, received minimal severance, watched as their pensions and retirement accounts lost value along with the stock price. Vendors who had shipped merchandise in good faith expecting payment were told they would receive a fraction of what they were owed, if anything. The lawyers and consultants and restructuring professionals who descended on the bankruptcy collected hundreds of millions in fees while presiding over the dismemberment of what remained. The emergence from bankruptcy in 2004 was presented as a new beginning, a phoenix rising from ashes, but it was really just a temporary reprieve, a brief pause before the final decline. Kmart was smaller and weaker, had shed debt and bad stores, but hadn't addressed any of the fundamental operational problems that caused the bankruptcy in the first place. The stores were still outdated and poorly operated. The systems were still inferior to Walmart's. The vendor relationships were still damaged. The brand was now associated with bankruptcy and failure rather than value and selection. The competitive environment had only gotten worse, with Walmart stronger than ever and Target successfully executing their strategy and new competitors like dollar stores taking share at the low end. When Eddie Lampert merged this weakened Kmart with an also struggling Sears in 2005, he created a combined entity that had all the problems of both companies, plus the additional complexity of trying to integrate different operating systems and cultures and strategies. The promised synergies never materialized because Lampert never actually tried to create synergies. He ran the companies as separate fiefdoms competing for resources, implemented bizarre policies that pit departments against each other, treated the whole enterprise as a collection of assets to be monetized rather than an operating business to be improved. The retail operations continued deteriorating under his ownership, got worse every year, lost more market share and more customer confidence and more employee morale. The workers who stayed with Kmart through the Sears merger and the subsequent decline were caught in an impossible position. They needed the jobs, had bills to pay and families to support, couldn't easily find alternative employment, especially in markets where retail was generally declining. But they were working for a company that was visibly dying, that cut their hours and reduced their benefits and provided no training or development or path for advancement. They watched as stores got dirtier and inventory got sparser and customers got fewer. They dealt with the frustration and sometimes anger of customers who blamed store employees for corporate failures, who didn't understand that the workers had no control over inventory or pricing or store conditions. They endured the indignity of working for a company that had become a joke that their friends and family viewed with pity or contempt. Many of these workers were lifers, people who had started at Kmart in better times and stayed through loyalty or inertia, or lack of alternatives. They remembered when Kmart was a good employer, when the stores were clean and busy and the company invested in its workers. They had skills and product knowledge and customer relationships that would have been valuable in a well-run retail environment but were wasted in the declining Kmart. Some took early retirement when buyouts were offered, accepting reduced pensions to escape the stress. Others held on until stores closed and they were laid off, then struggled to find comparable employment in a job market that didn't value retail experience and discriminated against older workers. Their stories are the human cost of Kmart's failure, the lives disrupted and careers ended and retirement plans destroyed by executive decisions made in distant offices by people who never faced consequences. The communities where Kmart stores closed faced different challenges depending on their economic diversity and size. Rural communities where Kmart might have been the only discount retailer within 20 or 30 miles lost access to affordable goods and had to drive significant distances to shop at Walmart or regional competitors. This was particularly hard on elderly residents and people without reliable transportation, creating retail deserts that disadvantaged the most vulnerable. The empty Kmart buildings became blight, too large and too specific in design to easily repurpose, often sitting vacant for years, deteriorating physically and dragging down property values around them. Some communities tried to attract new retailers or repurpose the buildings for other uses, but in an era of retail decline and e-commerce growth, the market for large retail boxes was weak. Urban and suburban communities with more retail options experienced Kmart closures differently, but still felt the impact. The stores had been employers, providing entry-level jobs and advancement opportunities for people without college degrees. They had been convenient options for shopping, particularly for people who didn't have cars and depended on public transportation to access retail. They had been gathering places in some communities where people ran into neighbors and socialized while shopping. The closures represented loss of local employment and convenience and community space, even if alternative shopping options existed. The tax base impact was significant in some communities, forcing budget cuts or tax increases to offset lost sales tax revenue. The landlords and property owners affected by Kmart closures faced financial stress and strategic challenges. Kmart had been anchor tenants, drawing traffic that benefited other retailers and shopping centers. When Kmart closed, foot traffic declined, making other tenants less viable, sometimes triggering a cascade of closures that killed entire shopping centers. Landlords had financed their properties based on Kmart's rent, often had mortgages and other obligations that assumed that revenue stream would continue. When Kmart rejected leases in bankruptcy or negotiated reduced rent or simply closed stores, landlords faced their own financial crises, sometimes leading to foreclosures and property sales at distressed prices. The ripple effects extended through commercial real estate markets, affecting property valuations and lending decisions and investment returns. The comparison between Kmart's failure and the survival of Target provides another perspective on what went wrong. Target, like Kmart, was founded in 1962 as a discount retailer competing with traditional department stores on price. Target, like Kmart, faced the same competitive pressure from Walmart's operational excellence and low prices. But Target made different strategic choices that allowed them to survive and eventually thrive while Kmart collapsed. Target invested in design and branding, creating a cheap chic positioning that differentiated them from pure price competitors. They partnered with designers and created exclusive brands that couldn't be found elsewhere, giving customers reasons to choose Target beyond just price. They invested in store design and experience, making shopping at Target more pleasant and aspirational than shopping at other discounters. But crucially, Target also invested in operations and systems, in the less glamorous infrastructure that makes retail work. They built distribution networks and inventory systems that weren't as sophisticated as Walmart's but were far better than Kmart's. They maintained clean, well-organized stores that executed consistently. They staffed adequately and trained employees to provide decent service. They understood that the brand positioning and design partnerships only worked if the operational execution delivered on the promise, if the stores were actually pleasant to shop in and the products were actually available. Target shows that it was possible to compete with Walmart by differentiating on dimensions other than pure price, but only if operational excellence supported the differentiation strategy. Kmart tried half-heartedly to copy Target's approach with celebrity partnerships and exclusive brands, but never committed to the operational investments necessary to execute successfully. They wanted the benefits of differentiation without paying the costs of supporting it. They wanted customers to perceive them as stylish and design-conscious while operating stores that were objectively worse than Walmart's utilitarian boxes. The disconnect between aspiration and reality was obvious to customers, creating a credibility problem that made the Martha Stewart and Joe Boxer partnerships feel like lipstick on a pig. cosmetic improvements that couldn't hide fundamental ugliness. The question of whether Kmart could have been saved, whether some alternate set of decisions might have led to survival or even success, is impossible to answer definitively but worth considering. If Kmart had invested in operations in the 1980s when they still had time and resources, if they had matched Walmart's technology investments and distribution efficiency, they might have remained competitive on price and availability. If they had committed earlier and more completely to differentiation through design and branding like Target, if they had actually supported those strategies with operational excellence, they might have found a sustainable positioning. If they had stayed focused on discount retail instead of diversifying into unrelated businesses, if they had avoided the debt and acquisitions that consumed capital and attention, they might have maintained their market position. But all of these counterfactuals require different leadership making different decisions based on different priorities. And leadership at Kmart was selected and rewarded for exactly the financial engineering and growth through acquisition mentality that destroyed the company. The board members who hired the CEOs who made the bad decisions were themselves selected for their financial expertise and connections rather than retail operations knowledge. The institutional investors who owned large stakes in Kmart's stock cared about quarterly earnings and short-term stock price performance rather than long-term competitive positioning. The whole system was designed to produce exactly the outcomes it produced, to reward financial manipulation over operational excellence, to elevate people who were good at deals over people who were good at retail. The legacy of Kmart is a warning about the consequences of neglecting operational fundamentals, about the compounding nature of competitive disadvantage, about how companies can destroy themselves through decisions that seem individually reasonable but collectively catastrophic. Business schools will study the Kmart case for generations, analyzing what went wrong and how it could have been prevented, debating whether the failure was inevitable or avoidable. The lessons are clear. Operations matter. Technology matters. Culture matters. Customer experience matters, and no amount of financial engineering or promotional activity or celebrity partnerships can compensate for fundamental operational weakness. Walmart won not because they were lucky or because market forces inevitably favored them, but because they built superior operations and executed relentlessly and invested in the capabilities that made them unbeatable. Kmart lost not because they were unlucky or because they faced impossible competition, but because they made bad decisions decade after decade, because they prioritized the wrong things, because they believed that retail was a financial game rather than an operational business, because they elevated people who had no business running a retail company and gave them power to destroy value on a spectacular scale. The blue light that once symbolized American discount retail and bargain hunting and the democratization of consumption through low prices is now just a cultural reference, a nostalgic reminder of something that no longer exists, a symbol of failure rather than success. The stores are mostly gone. The jobs are gone. The company is gone in any meaningful sense. What remains is evidence of how not to run a retail business, lessons written in the wreckage of what was once America's discount retail leader. In the parking lots of closed Kmart stores across America, you can still sometimes find the concrete pads where the sign poles stood. The mounting brackets still visible even though the signs have been gone for years. These are archaeological remnants of a retail empire that collapsed, physical evidence of commercial infrastructure that once served millions of Americans but is now obsolete and abandoned. The buildings themselves, when they haven't been demolished or repurposed, still bear the architectural signatures of Kmart's design standards, the particular proportions and materials that were replicated across thousands of locations. You can identify a former Kmart even when the signage is gone and another tenant has moved in, can recognize the bones of what was beneath whatever cosmetic changes have been applied. These spaces tell stories about American economic transformation, about how we once organized commerce and consumption, about what we've lost and what we've gained in the shift from physical retail to e-commerce and from general merchandise stores to specialized formats. They're not beautiful ruins in the way that abandoned industrial facilities or grand theaters are beautiful. They're just empty boxes, utilitarian structures that were never designed to be anything more than containers for merchandise and shopping. But they represent something real about American life, about how millions of people worked and shopped and built their livelihoods, about what happens when business models that sustain that way of life become obsolete and nothing adequately replaces them for the people who depended on them. The few Kmart stores that still operate exist in a kind of retail purgatory, neither fully alive nor completely dead, kept operating through some combination of lease obligations and Eddie Lampert's continued belief that there's value to be extracted even from the corpse of a failed retailer. They serve almost no one well, not the employees who work there with no job security or future prospects, not the customers who shop there out of desperation or habit rather than choice, not the communities that would be better served by having the space repurposed for something viable. They're monuments to sunk costs and the difficulty of letting go, physical manifestations of the human tendency to keep dying enterprises on life support long after any reasonable hope of recovery has passed. The blue light is gone from these stores, the iconic symbol of Kmart's glory days now retired or gathering dust in storage rooms, a piece of retail history that belongs in museums rather than functioning stores. The promise that light represented, the promise of deals and excitement and the thrill of finding bargains, was broken so thoroughly by years of operational failure and strategic incompetence that no amount of nostalgia can resurrect it. Kmart taught America to hunt for bargains and to expect everyday low prices and to believe that discount retail could deliver quality and value. Then Kmart failed to deliver on those promises while Walmart and Target and Amazon and countless other competitors did deliver. And customers learned that the promise mattered less than the execution. That what you actually experienced in stores mattered more than what marketing told you to expect. The millionaire mistake, the catastrophic error that destroyed billions in value and hundreds of thousands of jobs and served as a cautionary tale for business students everywhere, wasn't a single decision or a single leader's failure. It was a systematic pattern of choosing financial engineering over operational excellence, of prioritizing growth through acquisition over organic improvement, of believing that retail was about deals and promotions rather than execution and efficiency. It was the elevation of executives who had no business running a retail company, who viewed stores from spreadsheets in distant offices rather than understanding them through customer experience and operational reality. It was the culture that developed over decades where operational problems were dismissed as implementation failures rather than strategic issues deserving senior management attention. It was the compounding of small bad decisions into catastrophic accumulated disadvantage, the death by 1,000 cuts where each cut individually seemed survivable but collectively proved fatal. Every dollar not invested in technology, while Walmart built superior systems, made the competitive gap wider. Every acquisition that distracted from core retail operations made the fundamental business weaker. Every year of deferred maintenance and reduced staffing made the store experience worse and drove more customers to competitors. By the time the crisis was undeniable, the operational disadvantage was so large that no realistic turnaround plan could have closed the gap. Kmart was simply too far behind, too weak operationally, too damaged in brand perception to compete with Walmart's machine-like efficiency or Target's aspirational positioning or the countless other competitors who were executing better. The human legacy of Kmart's failure extends beyond the workers who lost jobs or the communities that lost stores. It includes the erosion of trust in American corporations, The understanding that companies that promise to serve communities and provide good jobs can abandon those promises when financial pressures mount, or when executives decide that maximizing short-term value matters more than long-term sustainability. It includes the lost opportunities for the hundreds of thousands of workers who might have built careers at Kmart if the company had been managed competently, who might have developed skills and earned middle-class incomes and provided for their families, but instead were laid off when stores closed or quit in frustration before the final collapse. It includes the communities that were shaped around Kmart's presence, that built commercial districts and traffic patterns and economic relationships assuming Kmart would be a permanent fixture, then had to adapt when that assumption proved wrong. The final chapter of Kmart has not yet been written because a handful of stores still operate, and because Eddie Lampert continues to control what remains of the company, and because the legal and financial complexities of complete liquidation haven't been resolved. But the ending is already known, already determined by the mathematics of a retail business that generates inadequate returns and serves no strategic purpose for anyone involved. The question is not whether those remaining stores will close, but when. Not whether Kmart will finally die, but how long the corpse will continue its zombie existence before someone decides it's time to bury what's left and move on. When that final ending comes, when the last Kmart closes its doors for good, it will mark the official end of a company that once transformed American retail and pioneered discount shopping and served millions of families. A company that squandered every advantage through incompetence and mismanagement, and became instead a warning about how not to run a business. The blue light will remain dark, a symbol not of deals and excitement, but of failure and waste and opportunities lost.